Melissa and Alex Carter thought they were moving into a quiet suburban dream until thou. HOA President Lorraine Simmons decided their refusal to join her association was a personal attack. What began as neighborly pressure quickly spiraled into surveillance, false reports, and a police visit that shattered their peace. Alex and Melissa Carter had been searching for the perfect home for nearly a year. After countless tours, missed offers, and rising prices, they stumbled upon a house on Birch Lane that felt like it was waiting just for them. A cozy, two-story home with blue shutters and a big front yard. It sat slightly off from the main row of properties, nestled behind a row of trimmed hedges. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets were clean, and the people waved as they drove by. It felt like a peaceful little corner of the world, just what they had hoped to find for themselves and their two young children. The Carters weren't just looking for a house. They were searching for stability. Life had been chaotic the last few years. They moved for job changes, dealt with a difficult landlord, and finally saved enough for a permanent place to call home. Birch Lane offered a fresh start. The property had been owned by an elderly couple who moved to assisted living, so the home had an old-fashioned charm but was in excellent condition. There was no sign of trouble, no mention of anything unusual. The price was fair, the inspection went smoothly, and the sale closed within a month. The day they moved in, the neighbors smiled and waved. A few even brought over cookies or offered help unloading boxes. It felt like something out of a movie. Alex joked that they had landed in Pleasantville. Melissa agreed. She had been nervous about the move, but Birch Lane quickly eased those worries. What the Carters didn't realize was that while their home sat physically among the other houses on Birch Lane, it was not technically part of the official Homeowners Association. The previous owners had bought the lot before the HOA was formed, and though many surrounding homes were under HOA jurisdiction, theirs was exempt. The detail was small and buried in the property documents, but it would soon become the spark for a storm they never saw coming. A week after they moved in, Melissa noticed a woman standing across the street, watching their house. She wore oversized sunglasses and held a clipboard. She didn't wave. Instead, she scribbled something down and walked away. Melissa mentioned it to Alex that night, brushing it off as neighborhood curiosity. But something about the woman's presence felt off. 2 days later, they found a flyer stuck in their mailbox. It was a welcome letter from the Birch Lane Homeowners Association. The letter congratulated them on moving in and politely requested that they attend the upcoming HOA meeting. At the bottom of the page, in bold print, was a reminder about monthly dues and rules that applied to all residents. Melissa was confused. They hadn't signed up for an HOA. She checked the paperwork from the closing process. Sure enough, their house wasn't under HOA authority. Still, she assumed it was a harmless mistake and ignored the note. That's when the real pressure began. Another letter came. A few days later, this one had a more serious tone. It stated that, even though their property was technically exempt, participation was expected as a sign of neighborly cooperation. It listed suggested dues and warned of possible complications from non-compliance. Melissa showed the letter to Alex. He laughed it off, calling it pushy but harmless. Then they learned the name of the woman with the clipboard, Lorraine Simmons. Lorraine wasn't just a neighbor, she was the self-appointed queen of Birch Lane. As the long-standing president of the HOA, she considered it her duty to keep the neighborhood running smoothly. Over the years, she had created a reputation for being strict, involved, and, according to some whispers, a little too invested in other people's lives. Lorraine didn't like when things were outside her control, and the Carters' refusal to join the HOA struck her as a threat to everything she had built. It didn't matter that they weren't legally required to join. In her mind, if they lived on Birch Lane, they needed to follow her rules. What started as a couple of letters soon escalated. Melissa noticed Lorraine walking by their property nearly every day, sometimes taking photos. Packages went missing from their porch. Their trash bin was mysteriously knocked over twice in a week. Little things, small annoyances that made Melissa feel like someone was watching, waiting. It all seemed petty, strange, and uncomfortable. But still, the Carters tried to ignore it. They had no idea what Lorraine was truly capable of. The next few weeks felt like walking on glass. Melissa started to dread checking the mailbox. More letters arrived, all stamped with the HOA seal and all bearing Lorraine's name. Each one had a different tone. Some were fake friendly, pretending to extend a warm invitation to join the community in unity, while others felt almost threatening, filled with references to rules, codes, and possible repercussions. The Carters hadn't signed up for any HOA, and Melissa was certain their property wasn't included. She double-checked a deed, consulted the title company, and even contacted the county office. The answer was clear. Their home sat on land that predated the HOA's formation and was legally exempt from all of its guidelines, but Lorraine didn't care about technicalities. Her version of Birch Lane was orderly, clean, and under her complete control. And in her eyes, Melissa and Alex's refusal to join wasn't just a rejection, it was defiance. Her vision of the perfect neighborhood didn't have space for people who did things their own way. It didn't take long before the subtle harassment turned into something bolder. One morning, Melissa found a warning letter taped directly to their front door. It accused them of violating noise ordinances due to a loud gathering that had allegedly occurred the night before. But there had been no gathering. The only sound came from their kids playing in the backyard, laughing as they sprayed each other with a garden hose. There were no parties, no music, nothing that even came close to a disturbance. Still, the warning was written like an official citation and signed with Lorraine's initials. Melissa crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. She was tired of playing this game. Then came the trash bin notice. Lorraine claimed their garbage cans were being left at the curb for too long, a violation of community policy. Again, their home wasn't part of the HOA, and yet these notices kept appearing. When Melissa placed the bins out just minutes before pickup one morning, she still found a warning taped to the side of the can. Alex suggested confronting Lorraine directly, but Melissa didn't want to escalate the situation. She believed that ignoring her would make her lose interest. But Lorraine was the type who thrived on control, and when she didn't get it, she didn't back off. She doubled down. That weekend, Alex caught Lorraine taking photos of their backyard from the sidewalk. She had her phone held high and didn't even try to hide it. When he called out to her, she quickly turned away and walked off. It was unsettling. They started to wonder what she was doing with those photos. Was she sending them to the HOA board, to other neighbors? Was she collecting evidence for some kind of case that didn't even exist? Things got even more disturbing when Melissa noticed a pattern with their deliveries. Several online orders, small. Things like household items and clothes for the kids, never arrived. The tracking showed them as delivered, but the packages were nowhere to be found. When Melissa called the delivery service, they said the driver had left them on the porch. There were no security cameras at the house yet, so they had no way to know what was happening. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was interfering. The only person who had a reason to make their lives difficult was Lorraine. Some of the neighbors started acting differently, too. People who had smiled and waved during their first week began to avoid eye contact. A few crossed the street when walking their dogs, pretending not to see Melissa or Alex. It wasn't just awkward, it felt deliberate. The friendly welcome they once received had vanished. Late one evening, while the kids were asleep and Alex was watching TV, Melissa sat in the kitchen flipping through a stack of HOA letters. She read them all again, trying to find some thread of logic or reason. But they weren't about reason. They were about power, about one woman's obsession with control, masked behind the rules of a neighborhood. Organization. She looked out the kitchen window and saw Lorraine's porch light turn on. Her shadow moved past the blinds. Melissa didn't know if Lorraine was watching her at that very moment, but she wouldn't have been surprised. This wasn't just about joining an association. It was about submission, about giving in to something that felt more like a cult than a community. And somewhere deep down, Melissa began to feel it. This wouldn't end quietly. Not as long as they refused to kneel to the self-declared queen of Birch Lane. It was a Saturday morning like any other. The sun was out, the breeze was light, and Melissa had finally decided to get some gardening done. Her daughter, Emma, played nearby with a plastic watering can, pretending to help. It was one of those rare calm moments that made the house feel like home again. Alex had gone into town to pick up supplies, and their son was inside watching cartoons. Melissa was focused on planting new flowers beneath the front window when the sudden sound of tires crunching gravel made her look up. 2 police cars pulled onto their driveway. At first, Melissa thought they must have taken a wrong turn. Maybe they were responding to a call on another street. But when the officers stepped out and walked straight toward her, she froze. One of them offered a calm but serious greeting, then asked if everything was all right at the property. Confused, Melissa said yes, everything was fine. That's when they told her they had received a report from a community member, someone claiming that Melissa had become hostile and had made threats against a neighborhood official. The words barely registered. Melissa blinked at them, stunned. She hadn't spoken to anyone outside the family in days. There had been no confrontation, no arguments, no threats. She tried to explain, her voice shaking slightly, but the officers were already scanning the yard, looking toward the house, asking if there was anyone else home. Emma clung to her side, sensing something was wrong. Melissa asked who had filed the report, and though the officers didn't name her directly, they referred to the HOA president. That told Melissa everything she needed to know. Lorraine had called the police. Standing in her yard with her hands covered in soil, Melissa tried to stay calm. The officers weren't aggressive, but the weight of the accusation hung in the air. It didn't matter that it was baseless. The fact that someone had made a formal complaint was enough to trigger a response. That was the point. Lorraine hadn't just made a false report. She had weaponized the system to intimidate them. The conversation was brief. One officer took notes while the other walked a short loop around the property, clearly finding nothing out of the ordinary. Melissa answered their questions as clearly as she could, all while trying not to cry or appear nervous. In the end, the officers apologized for the confusion and said they'd file the visit as a non-event. No charges, no further action. They left as quickly as they came, but the damage was already done. As the cruisers pulled away, Melissa glanced across the town's street. There, behind the blinds of a bay window, was the faint outline of a figure. Lorraine was watching. When Alex returned and heard what happened, he was furious. He wanted to go straight to her house and demand an explanation. But Melissa begged him not to. That's exactly what Lorraine wanted, a reaction, a moment she could twist into another complaint. She wanted to escalate things without ever getting her own hands dirty. It was a tactic. Provoke, report, repeat. They talked about installing security cameras and considered speaking to a lawyer, but neither option gave them any peace. The truth was, they felt trapped. They couldn't afford to move again, and legally, Lorraine hadn't done anything that could be easily challenged. It was all subtle, calculated, designed to push them toward compliance or push them out. Over the next few days, Melissa noticed the whispers again. People walking dogs would glance toward their home and murmur quietly to one another. A couple of kids playing outside were quickly called back indoors by their parents. The entire neighborhood felt colder, smaller, like the walls were closing. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Melissa realized just how far Lorraine was willing to go. This wasn't some harmless neighborhood squabble. It wasn't about dues or community rules. It was about power and fear, and Lorraine had just shown what she could do with both. But Melissa also knew something else. If Lorraine had to lie to the police just to shake them, it meant she was nervous. Nervous that they wouldn't break. Nervous that she was losing control. That small thought gave Melissa her first real sense of clarity in weeks. Lorraine had crossed a line, and one way or another, it would come back to her. The tension around the house didn't fade after the police incident. It thickened. Every sound outside felt amplified. Every footstep on the sidewalk made Melissa glance out the window. Even the kids had started to pick up on it. Emma asked why some neighbors didn't smile anymore, and their son had grown quiet, sticking close to his parents when playing outside. The home that was supposed to be a refuge now felt like a prison surrounded by manicured lawns and forced smiles. Melissa began keeping records, every letter, every incident, every strange occurrence. She logged the date and time of missing packages, took pictures of notes left on their door, and even saved screenshots of neighborhood group posts where Loren's name kept appearing. But for every documented moment of harassment, there was one more that couldn't be proven: the long stares, the whispered gossip, the quiet pressure to conform. She began to wonder how many other people had experienced it, but stayed silent. That question was answered one Thursday night. The doorbell rang just after 9 p.m., an unusually late hour for a visitor. Alex answered the door cautiously. A man stood on the porch, wearing a worn-out baseball cap and looking nervously over his shoulder. He introduced himself as David, a neighbor from a few houses down, and asked if he could speak with them privately. Melissa and Alex hesitated, but something about his posture, his glance, his voice told them he wasn't a threat. They invited him inside. David sat at their kitchen table and quickly got to the point. He had lived on Birch Lane for almost 10 years. He knew Lorraine well, and he'd been on the HOA board briefly before resigning out of frustration. He said he'd heard what happened with the police and wanted them to know they weren't alone. In a soft voice, David revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the years, Lorraine had pushed out 3 families. One couple was fined repeatedly until they sold their home. Another family left after Lorraine reported them for false violations, including claims of unapproved pets and unsanitary yard conditions. A third family moved out quietly after their teenage son was accused of vandalism, a claim that was never proven, but stuck long enough to shame them out of the neighborhood. Lorraine didn't just run the HOA, she ran it like a private empire. But now, things were changing. David had connected with other residents who'd grown tired of the fear. Quietly, they'd started documenting their own experiences, screenshots of group messages, printed copies of her letters, photos of her inspecting properties like a self-appointed inspector general. They were compiling a case against her, and David believed that Melissa and Alex's experience might be the last push they needed. He pulled out a folder from his bag and placed it on the table. Inside were dozens of documents, notes, timelines, even a few audio recordings. One file detailed Lorraine using HOA funds for private landscaping on her own property. Another showed how she had rewritten minor community rules without votes, then used those new rules to fine homeowners. Melissa's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. It was all there, black and white. Proof that Lorraine's behavior wasn't just unpleasant, it was calculated and corrupt. David explained that they were planning to call a special meeting. If they gathered enough support, they could vote Lorraine out and elect a new board. But they needed voices willing to stand up, especially families like the Carters, who had nothing to gain from the HOA and had still endured the worst of it. Alex agreed immediately. Melissa was slower to respond. She looked around their home, thinking of the kids, of the fear, of Lorraine staring from across the street. But then she looked back at the folder in front of her. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't felt since they moved in. Power. Before David left, he handed her a small USB drive. On it were testimonies from other residents, including one elderly woman who broke down in tears while describing Lorraine threatening to report her for declining property standards because she couldn't mow her lawn during chemo. Melissa clutched. The drive, like it, was made of gold. As the door shut behind David and the house went quiet again, Melissa turned to Alex and whispered what they were both thinking. It was time to end this. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, held in the community clubhouse just down the street. Word had spread quietly but effectively. Flyers were discreetly slipped into mailboxes. Conversations happened during dog walks and over backyard fences, and emails circulated among trusted neighbors. Lorraine knew something was coming. Her usual smug presence had grown sharper, more guarded. She patrolled the streets with a clipboard more often than usual, stopping to photograph anything even slightly out of place, as if gathering ammunition for a final defense. Melissa spent the days leading up to the meeting reviewing the files David had shared. She memorized timelines, statements, and figures. Her fear had shifted into resolve. She wasn't just protecting her family anymore, she was standing up for a neighborhood that had been manipulated for far too long. Even the kids seemed to notice the change in her energy. She was quieter, more focused, like a storm brewing just below the surface. That evening, the clubhouse parking lot filled quickly. Cars lined the curbs, and neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up, curious and cautious. Lorraine stood at the front of the room beside the podium, arms crossed, lips tight. She wore her signature red blazer, the one she always wore during board meetings, as though it gave her authority. Her usual group of loyalists sat nearby, but even they looked uneasy, their eyes darting toward the door every time someone new entered. Melissa and Alex arrived together, with David and 3 other residents walking in just behind them. The room grew quiet. Lorraine tried to maintain control, calling the meeting to order with her usual stiff politeness. But she didn't get far. David stood up first, interrupting the agenda. Calmly and clearly, he requested a motion to remove Lorraine as HOA president. The room froze. Lorraine laughed, an empty, high-pitched sound, and tried to dismiss the motion as procedurally invalid. But then another resident stood up to second it, and another. And another. That's when Melissa stood. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she began reading directly from the documents David had given her. She spoke of fines issued without proper cause, false police reports, misuse of funds, rule changes made without votes, and surveillance of private residents. She detailed Lorraine's long pattern of intimidation, harassment, and abuse of power. She referenced specific dates, quoted letters word for word, and played a brief audio clip from the USB drive. Lorraine berating a neighbor over the phone, threatening legal action over a lawn ornament. Gasps rippled through the room. Faces turned toward Lorraine, who now sat stiff and silent, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Then David handed out printed packets of evidence. Residents flipped through pages, seeing Lorraine's misconduct laid out in black and white. What had once been whispered rumors was now undeniable proof. A vote was called. The ballots were simple, yes or no. Should Lorraine be removed from her position? One by one, hands went up. Yes, yes. A few held back. A couple abstained. But the majority was clear. The final count left no room for doubt. Lorraine Simmons was officially removed as HOA president. She stood and tried to argue, called it a conspiracy, said she would speak to her lawyer, accused Melissa of fabricating evidence, but no one listened. The room had turned. Whatever power she once held had drained from her completely. A new board was formed that night. Temporary leaders were selected to restore order and rewrite outdated rules. One of the first motions passed was to prohibit the use of HOA resources for surveillance or personal disputes. Another was to affirm that properties outside the HOA boundaries, like the Carters, were not subject to any of its rules or dues. As people filed out of the clubhouse, many stopped to thank Melissa. One older man quietly said, "We should have done this years ago." The walk home felt lighter. The air seemed clearer. For the first time since moving to Birch Lane, Melissa didn't feel eyes on her back. She didn't worry about mailboxes, trash bins, or garden decorations. She had faced down a bully, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered silently. That night, as she stood on her porch looking across the street, Lorraine's house was dark. No clipboard. No watching silhouette. The neighborhood finally belonged to the people again, not to the rules, and certainly not to Karen.